It's the Nole Insiders game preview. Lane Hurt along with Tim Lenefelt as Florida State gets set to take on the Clemson Tigers. 8 o'clock on ABC, a primetime showdown inside Doak Campbell Stadium. Before we get started, let's talk a little bit about Clemson. Obviously undefeated, 7-0, 4-0 in the ACC, number 3 in the country. Surprisingly, with the great weapons they have, 35th in the country in total offense, 474 yards a game. They're led by, of course, quarterback extraordinaire Deshaun Watson, 16th in the country in total offense. Defensively, even better than offensively, though. 8th in total defense in the NCAA, giving up under 300 yards a game. Tim, this rivalry has seen some great matchups, some really great teams. What are your thoughts on this year's game?
I think it should be a pretty big challenge for Florida State. I actually kind of like where Florida State's at for this game. It's just in terms of what Clemson's done, to this point. I think, look, it's going to be a tough game. Marquez White the other day said they're the best team that we've played this year, and I think coming into the season, you knew that. But I also think that Florida State, their defense is on a bit of an upswing after games against Miami and Wake Forest, just to get some confidence back and play well. So I think they're feeling pretty good about themselves. The offensive line, you like to think, is coming together, especially in the running game. And Dalvin Cook, I think, is playing as well as he has at any point this season. He leads the nation in yards from scrimmage. We know Clemson's defensive line is really good. That defense is fantastic, of course. But you know what? They were really good last year. And Dalvin Cook still had a really big day against Clemson in Death Valley. So I think you're going to see a lot of Dalvin Cook. I think if the defense can hold up its end of the bargain. And look, you're not going to shut down Deshaun Watson and that crew completely. But if they can just hold their own and give Florida State's offense a chance, I think this could be a pretty compelling matchup.
And not to mention, Florida State does have 2 losses, but let's not forget, Clemson played for a national championship last year.
Mm-hmm.
They're in line. This is definitely the hardest game left on Clemson's schedule. Yeah. This is the one that they need if they want to go play for a national title.
And look, Clemson should have a loss if you remember that NC State game. And I know shoulds, whatever, and anybody who followed Florida State in 2014 is not going to get hung up on games that you should have lost. Or you think you should have lost. But the fact of the matter is, NC State had Clemson, essentially, and the poor kid missed a field goal. And you could, I remember we were watching that in the press box before the Wake Forest game kicked off, and you could just hear the groan across the. There's no cheering in the press box, but I think there is groaning allowed in these types of circumstances, especially when it's another game. And so I wonder, how does that game, that NC State game, that's Clemson's last game, they had a bye week as well as Florida State last week. What does that do? Does it recalibrate and refocus Clemson and say, hey, we need to start playing more up to our capabilities because we've seen what can happen? Or is that just a sign that the wheels are maybe a little loose on the wagon and that Clemson is ripe for the upset? I don't think we know that for sure because, again, we haven't seen Clemson play since then. But obviously, if you're Florida State, you'd like to think that game was a sign that this team can be had. And maybe that's the case. We'll see.
Well, let's move to our stat of the week. Thanks from the guys at Pro Football Focus. On Facebook Live yesterday, Tim, I think you rightly said one of the key matchups this week is how well Florida State's receivers play, and they're going to need to play well. Well, looking at their snaps this year, you have Travis Rudolph obviously leading the team in snaps with 497, but second is Bobo Wilson with 379. It's becoming increasingly likely that Bobo is not going to play on Saturday, which leads to the guy who seemed to take those snaps against Wake Forest in Auden Tate, who had a season-high 48 snaps against the Demon Deacons.
Yeah, I think there's no secret there. That's a direct correlation. Bobo Wilson being out showed us obviously what I think we suspected for a while, which is that Auden Tate is the next man up. And what I think was interesting about that is that there wasn't really much of a rotation beyond Auden Tate. It was his show, and we saw him come down with that beautiful touchdown catch against Wake Forest that turned out to be a pretty big play in the game. So I think you're going to see a lot of Auden Tate on Saturday. And what's kind of interesting about that, and I mentioned this yesterday on Facebook Live, was that Clemson really doesn't have a whole lot of film on Auden Tate because there isn't a lot of film on Auden Tate, at least not compared to Bobo Wilson, who has played against Clemson for 3 years. This will be the first time that Clemson's really got a good look at him. Certainly his physical skill set is different than anybody else on the Florida State roster just in terms of his stature and his size. And so maybe that can be sort of a, I hate to use the term X factor because it kind of sounds like a cliche, but I think it actually does apply here that he could really be a difference maker in this game.
He does change the geometry of what Florida State does in offense. He's a guy who you're going to throw the ball up to him a little bit more and take a chance. Maybe he's covered, but you still throw the ball because he's bigger than the guy who's on him. It's fascinating, especially once you get into the red zone.
I failed geometry.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, I was saying that's why I write for a living. I'm in English, So, but anyway, no, I do think absolutely he's the kind of guy that maybe when you have a be as precise as it otherwise would be. He's a guy that can go up and just make something happen, go up and get it. And if he can't get it, at least the opposing defensive backs can't either. So, yeah, I expect Auden Tate, one way or the other, to have a pretty significant impact on this game.
Well, back to our now matchup of the week. Another wide receiver, this one from Clemson, Mike Williams versus the Florida State secondary. Williams is the third-rated receiver in the ACC in yards per game. He averages 5.5 receptions per game, 39 on the season, 578 yards. The Noles are going to want Marquez White on him. They're going to try to move him around, probably get him on Tavares McFadden, if possible, a guy who's been targeted 30 times this year and has been kind of feast or famine at points. I think that's a matchup Clemson likes. How can the Noles combat that and limit his impact on the game?
Well, I wonder, we've seen Florida State over the last couple of weeks play a little bit more man-to-man on defense, and I think it has suited them, at least against against Miami and Wake Forest. And that could be one way, just tell Marquez White, or even if you like what Tavares McFadden can do, if he's had a good couple weeks of practice, and remember he has had the bye week to work on some things as well, say, hey, you find him when he leaves the huddle and you line up across from him and you follow him around wherever he goes. So that's one way that could work. And Mike Williams, he's a talented player. For as much as we talk about Auden Tate just a second ago, Mike Williams is kind of the more advanced form of that, and then he's more experienced, he's been through a little bit more, and has, I guess, just more game time, game action. But in terms of the physical stature and the physical ability, he has everything you want in a receiver and everything you want in a potential next-level player. And Marquez White said earlier this week that he's a first-round guy. So they're going to have their hands full. It wouldn't surprise me if he saw a lot of double teams, moved a safety over to kind of help cover him, because he's going to be a handful no matter who's covering him. So I expect to see mainly Marquez White, but I do think Tavares McFadden's going to get a dose of him as well. And I think both of those guys are going to need to win at least their share of that matchup for Florida State's defense to be successful.
It'd really be acute of Florida State's defense to make sure they keep tabs on Mike Williams.
But what's the hypotenuse?
That is for our next game preview, fans, and that's what we call a segue. Of course, Florida State, Clemson on Saturday night. Make sure you read Tim's First in 10 article. It's already up on Seminoles.com. And, of course, we'll have your 3 keys to a Florida State victory on Saturday as Florida State gets ready for the Tigers. So for Tim, I'm Lane. We promise no more geometry jokes. Go Noles.